In the sprawling futuristic city of Sci-fi, human diplomat Rex Hargrave found himself at the heart of an unprecedented situation. The city, known for its towering glass spires and vibrant neon lights, was the host of the Intergalactic Peace Summit, where representatives from various species gathered to discuss matters of trade, diplomacy, and cooperation. Rex, a man with a reputation for smooth negotiations and a calm demeanor, had been chosen to represent humanity in this grand event. He had seen many alien species during his travels, each with its own customs and intricacies. But nothing could prepare him for the encounter that would change everything. Rex's task was simple: to establish a treaty between the human race and the Viren Empire, a powerful species known for their strict, warrior-based culture. The Virens were known for their impressive physiques, glowing skin, and a strong sense of pride in their traditions. Their princess, Zyra, was one of the most influential figures in the empire. Zyra had a striking presence. Her skin was a deep shade of indigo, and her long silver hair flowed like liquid metal. As she entered the room, all eyes turned toward her. She walked with grace, her every movement a testament to the power she wielded. Zyra was more than just royalty. She was a warrior, feared and respected by all who knew her. And yet, on this day, she was not expecting a confrontation of any kind. The room was filled with dignitaries and diplomats from various planets. Rex, ever the professional, was engaged in a conversation with a fellow diplomat when he felt a light touch on his shoulder. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming it was a simple gesture of greeting or an accidental brush. But when he turned around, he was met with Zyra furious gaze. Her blue eyes were wide with shock and anger, her lips pressed into a tight line. She stepped back as if she had been burned, and her expression darkened even further. Rex could barely understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: he had made a grave mistake. "You touched me, human." Zyra voice rang out, icy and filled with outrage. "Without permission. You." She paused, her breathing sharp. "You have violated the most sacred law of the Viren people. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Rex froze, trying to process the words. He had simply turned around, and in that brief moment, their hands had accidentally brushed. He hadn't meant anything by it, but to Zyra it was far more than an innocent mistake. The Viren culture placed great emphasis on personal space and boundaries, especially for those of royal blood. A touch without consent, no matter how minor, was seen as an unforgivable act. I'm sorry," Rex stammered, trying to explain himself. "I didn't mean to." But Zyra would hear none of it. Her anger surged like a storm, and her voice carried across the room, drawing the attention of everyone present. "Sorry. Sorry does not undo what you've done. In the eyes of Viren law, this is a crime." Rex's heart raced. He had never been one for confrontation, especially not in such a high-stakes environment. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for his next move. The tension was unbearable. He looked into Zyra eyes and saw nothing but fury. The Viren princess was not someone to be trifled with. She had the power to shape the fate of entire worlds, and now, it seemed, he had made himself her enemy. As the room buzzed with whispers and murmurs, Rex realized the gravity of the situation. What had seemed like a simple, accidental gesture had now become the spark for something much larger. Zyra anger was only the beginning. He had no idea what this would mean for him, for humanity, or for the future of the Peace Summit. But one thing was certain: his life and his future would never be the same again. The tension in the room was palpable as Rex Hargrave stood before Zyra, still struggling to grasp the full consequences of his accidental touch. He could feel the eyes of the other diplomats boring into him, each one watching the exchange like a slow-motion car crash. He tried to gather his thoughts, but the words seemed to fail him. Zyra fury was like a storm that didn't seem ready to pass anytime soon. Her eyes, glowing with a mix of anger and disbelief, pinned him where he stood. The murmurs around the room grew louder, and Rex could feel the weight of 1,000 gazes on his back. As Zara-Len took a step forward, her posture as rigid as ever, her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "You've broken the Coven Accord, human," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "And now you will pay the price." Rex blinked, his confusion growing. The Coven Accord, what was that? He had no idea what she was talking about, but the way she said it made it sound like a serious crime. He glanced around, but none of the other delegates were speaking up, all of them too afraid or too stunned to intervene. The silence felt suffocating. Rex swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. I didn't know. It was an accident." Zara-Len's gaze hardened. "Ignorance is no excuse in the eyes of the law," she replied, her tone unwavering. She took a step back, her arms crossing over her chest. "You may be a diplomat, human, but your actions have consequences. You've violated a sacred law, one that binds not just your body but your fate." Rex's stomach sank. The last words she had spoken echoed in his mind. Binds, fate. What was she talking about? He tried to speak again, but before he could form another sentence, an official from the Council of Species stepped forward. The council had representatives from various species across the galaxy, and the official now addressing Rex was a large four-armed alien with green skin and a helmet-like faceplate. According to Viren law, when a person from another species makes an uninvited touch, especially one of royal blood, it triggers an ancient protocol, the official explained, his voice grave and serious. The human in question must now become the mate of the Viren, whose personal space has been violated. Rex blinked in disbelief. Mate? Was this some kind of joke? He turned to Zara-Len for confirmation, but her eyes remained as cold as stone. The official continued, his words sinking deeper into Rex's mind. "This bond cannot be broken, not without serious consequences." "Consequences?" Rex asked, his voice rising slightly. "What do you mean, consequences?" The official stepped closer, lowering his voice as if he didn't want anyone else to overhear. "If you refuse this bond, if you try to break it, both of you will suffer a fate worse than death. You'll be hunted by the Viren Empire. And worse yet, your species will bear the guilt of dishonoring our laws." Rex's head spun. What had started as a diplomatic mission had now turned into something out of a nightmare. The peace summit, his carefully planned negotiations, all seemed to fade into the background as the weight of the situation settled on his shoulders. He had no idea what was going on. He had never heard of anything like this, and certainly not on the scale of what the official was describing. How could a simple accident, an innocent brush of hands, lead to something so dangerous, so serious? Zara-Len's sharp eyes cut through his confusion. "Now you understand," she said coldly. "You are mine now, whether you like it or not. And there is nothing you can do to change it." Rex was at a loss for words. He had no idea how he was supposed to respond. His entire world seemed to have flipped upside down in the span of a few minutes. The very laws of the galaxy were turning against him. He was being forced into a situation that seemed utterly out of his control. He had always prided himself on handling diplomatic affairs with poise and intelligence, but this was something entirely different. This was not a negotiation, not a treaty. This was his life being ripped from his hands. As the official stepped back, and the room fell silent once again, Rex felt a knot form in his stomach. This was just the beginning of something far more complicated. And Zara-Len, the powerful and angry princess, was going to be at the center of it all. Rex couldn't help but wonder, how had everything gone so wrong, so quickly? Rex Hargrave's mind raced as he stood in the center of the room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like an invisible force. Zara-Len's words echoed in his head, each one more impossible to believe than the last. He was trapped in a legal system he didn't understand, bound to a woman he had never intended to touch, let alone become her mate. The whole thing felt like a bad dream, one he couldn't wake up from. Zyra, standing across the room, had made it clear that she had no intention of tolerating this forced bond. Her icy gaze remained fixed on him, and Rex could feel the tension between them thickening. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, was filled with the authority of someone who had been born into power, someone who could take down enemies with nothing more than a glance. And now, she was looking at him like he was her enemy, someone who had wronged her beyond repair. "This is a nightmare," Rex muttered under his breath. He had never imagined that his mission to secure peace for humanity would take such a bizarre and dangerous turn. He glanced at the other diplomats in the room, but none of them seemed willing to help. They were all too afraid of the Viren Empire to get involved, too afraid to speak out against their princess. Everyone knew the power she wielded, and no one dared question her. Zyra stepped forward, her voice cold and steady. "You think this is a joke, human?" she asked, her words sharp as daggers. "This is the law of my people. You touched me without permission. Now, you will pay the price." Rex's mouth went dry. "I didn't mean to. I swear. It was an accident." His voice faltered, but he fought to keep his composure. "I don't even know what you're talking about. How could a simple touch lead to something like this?" Zyra eyes narrowed. "You don't know because you're not of my people. You have no idea what you've done. But I'll make sure you understand. The bond is now formed. You will be my mate, human. You have no choice." Rex felt his heart race. This couldn't be real. He wasn't some alien prince or an ancient ruler. He was just a human diplomat, a man who had never been involved in anything remotely close to this kind of mess. The more Zyra spoke, the more the reality of his situation hit him. There was no escape, no way out. He had no idea how to fix this or if he even could. "I'm not your mate," Rex said firmly, his voice shaking but determined. "I don't care about your loss. I didn't ask for this, and I won't just let it happen." Zyra lips curled into a tight smile, but it was a smile that lacked warmth. "You think you can fight it? That you can escape it?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of amusement and contempt. "The bond is stronger than your defiance, and even if you try to break it, the consequences will be far worse than you can imagine." Rex clenched his fists, his frustration rising. How could a simple touch lead to this? It felt like the universe was mocking him, throwing him into a situation he was ill-prepared for. He had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was beyond his control. This wasn't a battle he could win through words or diplomacy. The laws of the Viren people were not something he could argue his way out of. He had no idea what he could do now, how he could possibly fix the mess he had found himself in. As the reality of his situation settled in, Rex realized one thing. He couldn't solve this alone. He needed to understand more about the Viren culture, about this bond that had been forced upon him. But more than that, he needed to find a way to break it, if that was even possible. The thought of being tied to Zyra, a woman who clearly hated him for something he didn't even intend, was unbearable. Zyra eyes never left him as she spoke again, her voice softer this time, but no less commanding. "You may not understand now, human, but you will. And when you do, you'll wish you never touched me at all." Rex's stomach churned. He had no idea how to undo this, but he knew one thing for sure. His mission, his life, and his future were now in the hands of the powerful, unforgiving princess before him. Rex Hargrave's head spun with the weight of the situation as he stood in the center of the room, trying to make sense of the bizarre and terrifying predicament he had found himself in. Zyra, the powerful and furious Viren princess, was glaring at him like he was a criminal, a trespasser in her world. The ancient laws of her people had just condemned him to a bond he never asked for, never wanted, and certainly didn't understand. He couldn't help but feel trapped in an alien world that didn't care for his own values or ideas of personal freedom. The thought of being bound to Zyra, of being her mate because of a simple accidental touch, was beyond absurd. He was a diplomat, not a pawn in someone else's political game. Xirelen's anger hadn't eased since the incident. If anything, it had grown stronger. Her eyes burned with a fire that Rex could feel even from across the room. She was determined to make sure he understood the seriousness of the situation, and no amount of apologies or explanations could change the fact that they were now linked by law. Rex tried to calm himself, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. The law had spoken, and there was no turning back. Or was there? In a desperate attempt to find some way out of this madness, Rex suggested they go to the Viren Temple of Unbinding, a place where mates could sever their connection if the bond was not truly meant to be. It was a long shot, he knew, but he had to try. Xirelen, as furious as she was, agreed reluctantly. They had no other options. If there was even a chance of breaking this bond, it was their only hope. The journey to the temple was fraught with danger. They had to travel through the dense and treacherous forests of Vioros, Xirelen's homeworld, where the trees grew tall and thick, their roots like twisted serpents beneath the surface. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the sounds of unseen creatures echoed through the underbrush. Rex had never been in such a wild, untamed place before. Every step seemed to bring them deeper into the unknown. But what truly unsettled him was the presence of Xirelen beside him. Her every movement sharp and calculated, her gaze constantly scanning the surroundings. She was a warrior at heart, but this journey seemed to test even her resolve. "Don't slow me down, human," Xirelen snapped as they trudged through the dense underbrush. "If you can't keep up, I'll leave you behind." Rex winced but held his ground. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm despite the discomfort of the rough terrain. "I'm in this with you, whether you like it or not." Xirelen's lips curled in a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it quickly disappeared as she turned her attention back to the path ahead. She was fierce, determined to reach the temple and fulfill the laws of her people, but Rex could see the doubt flickering in her eyes. She didn't want this bond any more than he did. But the difference was that she had been born into it, into a world where such bonds were sacred and inescapable. As the hours passed and they journeyed deeper into the forest, Rex couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in their interactions. At first, Xirelen had kept her distance, refusing to acknowledge him beyond the necessities of their journey. But now, there was a slight change in her attitude. She still held herself with an unapproachable air, but Rex could see glimpses of a different side to her, a side that wasn't solely defined by her duty and her anger. He had seen her vulnerability, her frustration with the situation, and it made him realize that they were not so different after all. They were both trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "I didn't ask for this," Xirelen said suddenly, her voice low but filled with raw emotion. "This bond, it wasn't meant to be. My life has already been decided for me, my future, my path. And now, this. I've always been bound by duty, by expectations. And now you're part of it." Rex looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. "I never wanted this either," he said quietly. "I didn't come here to get stuck in some political game. But I'm here now, and I'm not going to leave you to face it alone." For the first time, Xirelen paused in her stride, her eyes meeting his. There was something in them, a flicker of something that Rex couldn't quite place. Was it gratitude? Or was it simply a moment of understanding between two people who had been thrust into the same impossible situation? With a sigh, Xirelen resumed walking, but this time her steps were less rigid. There was an unspoken acknowledgement between them. Maybe they couldn't escape the bond, and maybe the road ahead would be long and difficult. But in that moment, Rex felt something shift, something that made him realize that, despite everything, they might just have a chance of making it through this together. As the journey continued through the dense, untamed forests of Vioros, the hours blurred together. The air grew heavier with each passing minute, and Rex couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation hanging over him like a dark cloud. His mind constantly raced, trying to figure out a way to reverse the bond he had accidentally formed with Zyra. The Viren princess, despite her fierce exterior, had become a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Every time he thought he understood her, something new would emerge, making her seem more complicated than ever. She was a warrior, a leader bound by duty and tradition, but beneath that armor, Rex had begun to see a side of her that was just as uncertain as he was. They reached a small clearing as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow through the trees. Zyra stopped abruptly, her posture stiffening as she scanned their surroundings. Rex felt the change in the air, a shift that made his skin tingle. It was the kind of alertness that only a seasoned warrior like her could maintain. "What's wrong?" Rex asked, stepping closer, instinctively lowering his voice. Zyra eyes narrowed, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of the blade at her side. "We're not alone," she murmured, her voice low but filled with a sense of urgency. Before Rex could react, a rustling sound came from the brush behind them, followed by a low growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Zyra didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, she unsheathed her blade, the metal flashing in the dimming light. Rex instinctively backed away, unsure of what to expect. A large reptilian creature emerged from the undergrowth, its scales glistening in the fading light. Its eyes gleamed a fierce yellow, and its jaws snapped as it advanced toward them. Rex's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively stepped in front of Zyra, though he had no idea what he could do to protect her. Zyra gave him a brief glance, her lips curling into a faint, almost amused smile. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice steady. "This is my fight." Without another word, she charged forward, her movements so fast that Rex barely had time to blink. Her blade sliced through the air with precision, cutting into the creature's thick hide. It roared in pain and fury, but Zyra didn't flinch. She danced around the creature with the grace of a predator, landing blow after blow. The sound of steel against scales filled the clearing, and Rex couldn't help but be in awe of her skill. The battle was over quickly, the creature collapsing to the ground with a final desperate hiss. Zyra stood over it, her breathing steady but her eyes burning with the intensity of someone who had faced death countless times. She wiped the blade clean with a cloth, the cool expression on her face betraying none of the effort it had taken to bring down the creature. Rex couldn't help but stare at her. The Viren princess had just shown him a side of herself he hadn't expected. The side of a warrior, capable and deadly, willing to do whatever it took to protect herself and the one she cared about. He had always known she was powerful, but watching her in action was something else entirely. It was clear now that Zyra was more than just a royal figure. She was a force to be reckoned with. "You could have gotten hurt," Rex said, his voice laced with concern as he stepped forward, his instincts taking over. "You didn't need to do that alone." Zyra sheathed her blade with a smooth motion, her expression unreadable. "I don't need your help, human," she replied, her tone cold but not unkind. "I fought alone for a long time. It's how I survived." Rex frowned but didn't press her further. He understood now, more than ever, how deeply her sense of independence ran. She had been raised in a world where strength was everything, where asking for help was seen as a weakness. But something inside Rex shifted as he watched her. It wasn't just her strength that impressed him. It was her vulnerability, the part of her that no one ever saw. The princess who had to hide her true self behind layers of duty and pride. The silence stretched between them as they both took a moment to catch their breath. Rex realized something he hadn't fully understood before, the bond that had been forced upon them. This strange connection might not be the curse he had thought it to be. If he could find a way to understand Zyra, if they could both learn to trust each other, maybe there was more to this than either of them had initially thought. Zyra turned away, her gaze softening for a brief moment before the wall of her resolve returned. "We continue tomorrow," she said quietly, her voice still firm but less harsh. She had let her guard down, just for a moment, and Rex wondered if that small shift was the beginning of something new between them. Perhaps in the end, this bond wasn't as impossible as he had once believed. The following morning, Rex awoke to the sound of birds calling in the distance and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the forest. Zyra was already awake, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, ever alert to danger. Despite the tension between them, Rex couldn't help but admire her focus. It was clear that she was always prepared for whatever came next, always calculating her next move. They had made camp near a small creek, the water rushing over smooth stones, creating a soothing sound that made the otherwise oppressive atmosphere of the forest feel a bit more peaceful. Zyra was already packing up their things, her movements precise and quick. She had always been a woman of action, and even in the midst of their strange, forced bond, her determination hadn't wavered. Rex sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess of sleep. His mind, however, was still buzzing with thoughts of the previous day. The battle with the reptilian creature, the way Zyra had handled it with such calm precision. It had been impressive, but it had also shown him how different their worlds were. He had never seen someone fight like that, and the thought that this fierce warrior might now be tied to him by something as strange as an accidental touch was still hard to wrap his mind around. "You're awake," Zyra voice cut through his thoughts as she stood, watching him with her piercing gaze. "Get up. We have a long way to go today." Rex nodded and stood, stretching his arms. "I'm up," he said, trying to push away the lingering fatigue. "What's the plan today?" "We make our way to the temple," Zyra said, her tone practical, but there was a slight edge to it. The Temple of Unbinding was their last hope, the place where, according to the ancient Viren laws, bonds like theirs could be severed. But the journey wasn't going to be easy. They still had to navigate through the wilds of Vairos, where danger lurked around every corner. Rex wasn't sure if they would even make it there, but he knew that they had no choice but to try. As they began walking again, the tension between them felt different. It wasn't as thick or suffocating as before. The silence was more comfortable now, like an unspoken understanding had begun to form between them. The more time Rex spent with Zyra, the more he began to see the complexities of who she really was. She wasn't just a royal princess trapped in the rigid traditions of her people. There was something deeper there, something that had been buried under her fierce exterior. "You're quiet today," Zyra remarked, glancing at him over her shoulder as they moved through the forest. "What's on your mind, human?" Rex hesitated, unsure whether to say anything, but there was something about the way she asked, almost as if she were genuinely curious, that made him want to open up. "I was thinking about yesterday," he admitted, "about how you handled that creature. You were amazing." Zyra didn't seem surprised, but her lips twitched slightly. "I've had a lot of practice. The forests of Vairos aren't kind to the unprepared." "I can imagine," Rex replied, glancing around at the dense, shadowy trees surrounding them. It was easy to feel small and helpless here, where the world seemed to hold so many unknown dangers. But still, it was impressive. "I've never seen anything like it." Zyra gaze softened, but only for a moment. "It's what I do. It's who I am. I've spent my life learning how to survive, how to fight. It's the only way to hold on to power in a world that's always changing." Rex nodded. He could see that, in her world, strength was everything. But there was something in her voice, a weariness beneath her confidence, that made him wonder if it had ever been any different for her. He knew that Zyra had grown up with responsibilities, with expectations placed on her from the moment she was born. But could there have been a time when she was just a girl, free of the burdens of her title? "I think you're more than just a fighter, Zyra," Rex said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You've got strength, yeah, but you've also got something else, something I can't quite put my finger on." Zyralen stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes flickered with something. Curiosity, perhaps. "And what would that be?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp at the same time. Rex shrugged, unsure of how to explain what he meant. "I don't know. It's like, there's more to you than just this warrior persona. It's like you're looking for something, but you're not sure what it is." For a long moment, Zyralen said nothing. She simply studied him, her gaze intense and unwavering. Rex felt a lump form in his throat under her scrutiny. But then, just as he thought she was going to brush him off, she spoke. The days passed quickly as Rex and Zyralen continued their journey deeper into the heart of Vaioros. The forest around them seemed endless, and every step they took was filled with the tension of the unknown. Each morning, Zyralen would wake up early, as if she was already prepared for whatever challenges the day might bring. Rex, on the other hand, was still adjusting to this strange world, to Zyralen's world. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized how much he had underestimated her strength. Not just her physical strength, but her mental resilience. She had a way of carrying herself with such determination that it almost made Rex forget that she was, in fact, just as human as he was, despite her alien appearance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew quiet. The usual sounds of creatures rustling in the underbrush had faded into an eerie stillness. Zyralen's sharp eyes scanned the darkness, every muscle in her body alert, while Rex felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had learned over the past few days to trust her instincts, but that didn't stop the unease from creeping over him. "What's going on?" Rex asked, his voice low, his nerves on edge. Zyralen held up a hand, signaling for him to be quiet. She didn't speak, but her eyes narrowed as she turned her head in the direction of a distant rustling sound. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and damp foliage, but Rex couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Something's coming," Zyralen muttered, her voice tense. Before Rex could respond, a group of shadowy figures emerged from the trees. They were humanoid in shape, but had the eerie, unsettling features of the creatures that roamed the wilds of Vaioros. Tall, with sharp claws, glowing eyes, and teeth that gleamed in the dim light. They had been tracking them for some time, and now they were ready to attack. Rex instinctively moved closer to Zyralen, his heart racing. "What are they?" he whispered. "Vairan hunters," Zyralen replied, her voice calm but filled with an edge of warning. "They're not after me. They're after you." Rex's stomach dropped. After me. He had no idea why these hunters would target him, but he didn't have time to question it. Zyralen was already moving, drawing her blade with one swift motion. Her eyes flashed with the intensity of someone ready for a fight. She didn't hesitate for a second. The hunters lunged toward them, their claws outstretched. Zyralen was faster than any of them, her movements like a blur as she dodged and countered with expert precision. The blade of her sword sliced through the air, cutting down the first attacker before moving on to the next. Rex could only stand there, frozen for a moment, watching the battle unfold before him. He had never seen anyone fight like this. Each strike was purposeful, each movement controlled. But even with her skill, Zyralen wasn't invincible. One of the hunters managed to land a blow, slashing a deep gash across her arm. Zyralen hissed in pain but didn't falter. She blocked the next attack with her sword, pushing the creature back with a powerful kick. But it was clear the fight was taking a toll on her. "Zyralen, look out," he shouted, noticing another hunter sneaking up behind her. In that instant, Zyralen's eyes flicked to the side, catching the movement. She pivoted just in time to face the hunter head-on, but the distraction had cost her. The hunter's claws raked across her side. Rex's heart pounded in his chest as fear surged through him. He couldn't lose her, not after everything they had been through. He had to help her. Without thinking, he grabbed a nearby branch from the ground, using it as a makeshift weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He swung the branch with all his might, striking one of the hunters in the face. It wasn't a clean hit, but it was enough to knock the creature back, giving Zyra the chance she needed to recover. "Stay focused, human." Zyra snapped, her voice low but filled with urgency. She retrieved her sword and swung it through the air, felling another hunter with a swift, decisive strike. Rex didn't have time to respond. The remaining hunters were still closing in, but Zyra was right. He had to stay focused. He took a deep breath and raised the branch again, ready for whatever came next. Together, they fought back, each move more coordinated than the last. Zyra strength and skill, combined with Rex's determination, turned the tide. Within moments, the hunters were defeated, their bodies scattered across the forest floor. Breathing heavily, Zyra wiped the blood from her sword and looked at Rex. Her eyes softened, just for a moment, as she took in the sight of him standing there, covered in dirt and sweat, but still standing. She hadn't expected him to fight, hadn't expected him to jump into the fray without hesitation. The days that followed the battle with the hunters felt different. There was a change in the air between Rex and Zyra, a silent understanding that neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both had felt. The forest around them seemed to reflect that change too. Less threatening, less oppressive. The once unnerving quiet of Vioros now felt more like an invitation to continue forward, to find what lay ahead. Every step was easier, and the distance between them and the Temple of Unbinding grew smaller with each passing day. Rex had become more in tune with their surroundings. Zyra had taught him to listen to the forest, to recognize the signs of danger long before it appeared. His senses sharpened as he spent more time in her presence, learning how to move through the dense underbrush without making a sound, how to spot the subtle signs of predators. Though he didn't have Zyra speed or skill, he had found a rhythm, something he could work with, and he wasn't as reliant on her as he had once been. One evening, as they camped near a sparkling lake, Zyra sat by the water, gazing out over the still surface. The moonlight reflected off the water, creating a silver sheen across the lake. She seemed lost in thought, her usually sharp features softened in the quiet of the night. Rex, always the curious one, couldn't help but ask. "What's on your mind?" he asked, stepping beside her. Zyra didn't immediately respond. She stared out over the water, her fingers skimming the surface lightly, as though she were searching for something just beneath the surface. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I've never been this far from home." Rex raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were a warrior. Aren't you used to traveling?" Zyra lips twitched, almost as if she were amused by his question. "I've fought on battlefields, but I've never crossed the wilds of Vioros like this. Not on my own, not without the eyes of my people on me. There's freedom in this, but there's also something unsettling about it." Rex considered her words. There was so much he hadn't known about her, about the pressure she faced every day, even before this strange bond had tied them together. The princess of Vioros, a leader of her people, yet she was just as trapped in her own role as he was in his. They were both bound by duty, by expectations, but here in the wilderness, there were no rules, no eyes watching them. "You're not alone now," Rex said, his voice steady. "You've got me. I don't know what you're running from, but you don't have to face it by yourself anymore." Zyra turned to look at him then, her eyes intense. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something raw and vulnerable that she rarely allowed anyone to see. For a moment, Rex saw not the warrior, not the princess, but just a person, like him, struggling to find their way. She didn't speak right away, but her lips parted as if she was about to say something. But then, as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. She stood up, brushing off the dirt from her clothes, her expression returning to its usual guarded calm. "We need to rest. Tomorrow, we reach the temple," she said, her tone now firm, as if the moment had never happened. Rex didn't press her further. He had learned that when Zyralen closed off, it was best to give her space. Instead, he nodded and gathered their things, making the campfire for the night. There was an unspoken agreement between them that rest was necessary, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both understood that the journey wasn't over yet. The Temple of Unbinding loomed closer with every step, but what awaited them there was still unknown. As the fire crackled, Rex gazed at Zyralen, who sat silently by the water. The moonlight bathed her in silver, and for the first time, he saw her not as the warrior princess he had been thrown into this strange world with, but as someone who was also lost, someone who carried the weight of expectations she had never asked for. She was more than just a Viren princess, and he was more than just a human caught in her world. They were two people who had been thrown together by chance, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a purpose to their bond. As the night fell around them, and the stars sparkled overhead, Rex couldn't help but wonder if their path to the Temple of Unbinding would lead them to more than just a way to sever the bond. Could it lead them to something neither of them expected? Something beyond the fight for survival? The answer, like the future, was uncertain. But for the first time, Rex felt a glimmer of hope, as if maybe the journey was worth it after all. The dawn of the final day arrived, and Rex could feel the tension thick in the air. The Temple of Unbinding loomed ahead, a massive structure carved into the side of a cliff, shrouded in mist and ancient power. For weeks, the temple had been their destination, their goal, where the bond that had tied him to Zyralen could be severed. But as they approached the stone steps leading up to the entrance, Rex couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. The temple was not just a place of magic. It was a place steeped in secrets, secrets that neither he nor Zyralen could possibly understand. Zyralen, ever composed, stepped forward without hesitation. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable, but Rex could see the flicker of something in her eyes. He had come to know her better over these weeks, how she carried the weight of her royal duties, how she hid the vulnerabilities beneath her fierce exterior. And now, standing at the edge of this final chapter, he realized just how much she had trusted him. It wasn't just about the bond they shared anymore. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had expected. As they ascended the steps, the air grew colder, and the sense of ancient power intensified. The temple's stone walls seemed to hum with energy, as if alive. Rex felt a prickling at the back of his neck, an almost overwhelming sensation that something was about to change, something they couldn't control. Zyralen reached the top first, her eyes scanning the entrance. She didn't say anything, but Rex knew she was as uncertain as he was. Together, they entered the temple, stepping into a large, dimly lit chamber. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, symbols Rex didn't understand but could feel resonating with energy. "You have come," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. Zyralen stepped forward, her eyes hard. "We have. The bond between us needs to be broken." The figure nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "The bond is not easily undone. There are consequences, both for you, Zyralen, and for the human." Rex exchanged a glance with her. The fear that had been building in his chest surged. "What kind of consequences?" he asked, his voice steady despite the anxiety that gripped him. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it extended a hand toward the altar, and the stone seemed to shimmer. "What you seek is not merely the severing of a bond," it intoned. "You seek freedom, but freedom comes at a cost. Your fates are now tied together in ways you cannot yet understand. To break that bond is to risk the unraveling of what has been." Zyralen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't hesitate. "We're prepared. The bond must be broken." The figure remained silent for a moment, as though measuring the weight of her words. Finally, it nodded. "Very well. Step forward." Rex's heart pounded as he moved toward the altar with Zyralen. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the temple itself was watching them. The figure gestured for them to stand side by side, and without a word, it began to chant in a language that Rex couldn't understand. The sound was strange, filled with ancient power, and as the words filled the room, the energy around them began to pulse. Zyra Len's hand brushed against his, and Rex looked at her. There was something in her gaze, something that told him she wasn't just doing this to rid herself of the bond. She was doing it because, deep down, she wanted to be free. But freedom didn't always mean separation. It meant growth, change, and understanding. And in this moment, Rex realized that he didn't want to leave her, didn't want to lose the connection that had grown between them. As the chanting reached a crescendo, the world around them seemed to shudder. The altar glowed brighter, and Rex felt the bond between him and Zyra Len flicker, pull, and twist. He felt pain, but it wasn't just his, it was hers too. It was a shared experience, as if their souls were being torn apart and remade. The energy surged through them both, and for a moment, Rex wondered if they would survive it. But then, as quickly as it had come, the pain stopped. The room was silent, the light dimmed, and the altar's glow faded. Zyra Len and Rex stood, panting, facing each other. The bond was gone, but something had changed between them. They weren't the same people they had been when they entered the temple. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged stronger for it. The figure looked at them, its expression unreadable beneath the hood. The bond is broken. But remember this, freedom comes with its own burden. You have chosen your paths, but those paths may not always lead where you expect. As the figure faded into the shadows, Rex turned to Zyra Len. Their journey had ended, but something had begun, something that neither of them could have predicted.